Trusting God When You're Struggling, Overcoming Obstacles to Faith by C.E. White, read by Annie Dinn. Chapter 4.
Self-sufficiency. 10 things undertaken for Christ at our own prompting will count for less than one thing done in His name at His bidding. G.P. Partington. The Still Small Voice. Quiet Hour Talks. Self-sufficiency is one of my biggest battles. I am a lone wolf, do-it-yourself, don't ask for help kind of person. Where my spiritual life is concerned, it's really not the best trait. I push and push and push myself only to grow weary and exhausted and give up. Too often, instead of taking up my cross and following Jesus, I take up my cross and follow myself. I plan every minute and give Him no room to move. The truth is, we often want to do it ourselves. Relying on someone else is scary, and it doesn't allow any room for pride. Let's face it, sometimes our ideas seem pretty darn good, and we don't bother checking with God before we make a royal mess. In Moses' case, a literal one. Though raised as a son in Pharaoh's house, Moses knew where he came from, and the plight of his people weighed on him. He probably often thought of his unique place of authority and influence and the best way to use it to their advantage. I'm sure he considered all sorts of political moves and ways to curry personal favor, methods making good use of his worldly means and position. I know I would have. When Moses came across the Egyptian guard beating the Hebrew slave, he decided he had to act, killing the guard and incurring Pharaoh's wrath in the process. Thus began his wanderings. In the act of defending someone, Moses lost everything. He went too far, and his good intentions saw him cast out, all his earthly power and influence gone in a moment. Can you imagine his feelings of defeat and failure? He probably thought he had blown it. He was on the cusp of being able to do something great for the Israelites when one misguided action ruined his chance. Thankfully, God's thoughts are not our thoughts, and His ways are not our ways. 40 years passed before God came back to Moses with a plan and led the Israelites out of slavery. 40 years Moses probably spent thinking he'd missed his chance to do something big. But God didn't want Moses' position and power. He wanted his obedience. You and I think we need the worldly means necessary to accomplish God's plans, and we often fall into despair if those means are stripped away. But when you feel confident in your money, your intelligence, your talent, or your position, it's easy to attribute success to yourself and your own abilities. It wouldn't have seemed very miraculous if Moses had diplomatically arranged the release of his people. But the way God did it in the end, with plagues and the parting of the Red Sea, no one could deny the hand of God in that situation. It is never your abilities that need to be at the forefront, but God's. If you are perfectly equipped by worldly standards, no one can see God's hand moving. I try to remind myself of this when I'm feeling inadequate. My experience tells me that most things God prompts me to do feel a bit like stepping off a cliff. Writing, for instance. It's a giant leap into the great unknown. When I sit down to write, a thing I know I am incapable of doing without the Lord's help, I suddenly find myself drawn to all the chores I've been putting off. Things I don't even enjoy, simply because I feel capable of doing them. Wash the dishes, pay the bills, fold the laundry. I want things I can do on my own with very little risk of failure. When, however, we step off the cliff into the tasks God has given us, we must totally rely on Him if they're to be done at all, and we don't like feeling reliant. We like to pretend we're in control. It's ironic that we seem to think trusting God with our lives is more difficult and uncertain than shouldering the entire burden ourselves and hoping for the best. But we want a formula, and God isn't formulaic. What He has for us to do may seem irrelevant or pointless or humiliating. Noah endured over 50 years of ridicule for building a boat when it had never rained. God's tasks are often unconventional, and their outcomes rarely seem certain. Being bold about my faith feels like that. Is it even making a difference? Denying myself to follow him feels like that. Is it worth it? Writing feels like that. Do people think I'm crazy for trying? But dishes are risk-free. I am confident in my bill-paying skills, and laundry feels like a thing I can do. I can plod on in mediocrity and the mundane, never delve into God's plan for me, and blame the world and my circumstances for any lack of fulfillment I feel. That I can do quite well. But can I step off the cliff into the unknown God has planned for me and potentially wander in uncertainty and ridicule for 40 years? 50 years? Like the Israelites, being enslaved feels like a thing I can do. They knew how to be slaves. They were perfectly capable of it all on their own. But they didn't know how to wander in the desert where they had to rely on God for absolutely everything. When you enter God's realm, you find yourself walking blind, so to speak. And until you've been walking with him for quite some time, it's difficult to trust that walking blind is worth it. It takes some exercising of that faith muscle I mentioned earlier. Most of the Israelites lost hope despite the fact that God supplied their every daily need. He literally sent them bread from heaven and guided their path by fire and cloud, but they still didn't believe him. This is eye-opening to me. Don't you often wish that God would just make things easy? He did that for the Israelites. They didn't have to worry a bit about their day-to-day needs, but they still weren't satisfied. They lost hope in the destination, the promised land. Maybe they stopped thinking God knew what he was doing. Or maybe they started thinking he didn't have their best interests at heart. If I'm honest, I have to admit that I start to grumble in the desert too. I can truly say I believe that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us. But I want to learn how to live like I believe it. I want to walk in uncertainty through difficult times and times I feel useless and times I don't understand. I want to use those circumstances to grow more intimate with the Lord. Even if there are years and years when I can't see the destination, I want to trust he's leading me right. It's easy to walk back into the mundane and the routine of my to-dos. In other words, to take up my cross and follow myself again. But it doesn't work. I feel increasingly restless and empty and worthless, despite checking the boxes and keeping up with life in a perfectly respectable manner. God's plan often takes me off the beaten path to a place I'm uncomfortable and uncertain, and it very often seems to take me away from my desires. But even when I don't understand what he's doing, the days I follow his lead always end with me feeling full and at peace. I'm actually not sure that stepping off the cliff, the initial flight from Egypt, is the hard part. I think a lot of people get that far. They don't like the slavery after all. But a few years into the wanderings, they give up and turn back. I thought you'd do more than this, God. I didn't leave everything I knew for the wilderness and endless uncertainty. Like the Israelites, we think we would have been better off if we'd stayed in Egypt. It feels like the Lord brought us out into the desert to starve. But the reason they felt like they were starving is because they continued to seek things he did not want for them. They chose to be discontented with his provision. In the desert, in your desert, God is your only chance for survival, for meaning, and for hope. The desert completely destroys even the illusion of being able to provide for yourself, but it is also full of him. Nowhere else can you more clearly see his work and his guidance. You can choose to dwell in the emptiness and your helplessness, or you can choose to dwell in the fullness of his provision and his presence. You have to trust him to rescue you and go on trusting him through all the dry places and the valleys along the way. Maybe you took a step of faith, but now you doubt the path. The voice of the enemy whispers, "Nobody cares. You're not doing anyone any good. It's a waste of time. There's nothing here." But if you listen, there is also God's voice. Keep going. Trust me. Follow me through this desert. The promised land awaits. It's worth it. Each time you die to yourself, God comes a little more alive in you. He must increase, but I must decrease. Following God's guidance will rarely lead you where you would choose to go, because He can see beyond your limited vision. He can see if taking a detour here will change lives exponentially or be totally pointless. He can see if you should clean your house today or leave it in total disarray to hang out with a friend. He can see when you need to give of your time even if you're already feeling depleted, or when you need to stay home, ignore all your checklists, and spend a day simply abiding in Him. But you can't know any of that if you're not in communion with Him, and you won't do it if you don't trust Him. When you deny yourself and take up your cross and follow yourself, your own plans and agenda, everything feels like a burden. It will weigh you down and down and down until you have no more strength. But when you deny yourself and take up your cross and follow Him, He renews your strength, and you will run and not be weary, walk and not faint. I have realized that I rarely know what will satisfy my soul and bring long-term good in my life, but He always does. And yet I somehow keep attempting to live a life of faith under my own strength, like a 3-year-old yelling, "I do it myself," when I've no business even trying. And just like that 3-year-old, I don't understand that I must grow and learn and that it takes time and patience and perseverance. I want to arrive before I have journeyed and to know before I have learned. But teleportation and osmosis work no better in the Christian walk than they do in the real world. The actual path requires a progression. Suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. You may suffer in the desert, but that suffering will produce endurance, then character, and finally hope. Isn't it interesting that hope is an outflow of character? We don't think of hope as a moral objective, but we can only have hope in all circumstances if we're living lives of faith like Abraham, who believed God and it was counted to him as righteousness. The Bible commands us to hope in the Lord so many times. This is not a vain wish, but is defined as an expectation of what is certain. It's a sincere trust and a confident assurance. The desert is where your hope in God will flourish because in it, He is all you can rely on. The longer you follow Him, the more of Him you will see, not because He changes, but because you do. Takeaways. God's purpose doesn't require any worldly advantages you seem to have. If you lose those advantages, He can still bring His plan for you to fruition. Your own abilities are, in fact, often a distraction, keeping you from trusting God and keeping others from seeing God's hand at work. God often has a plan you would never pick and can't understand, because it's impossible with our human limitations. God's path often looks meandering, aimless, or terrifying, but if you trust Him while you're on it, you will be both closer to Him and more fulfilled along the way. You often have to grow into His calling for you, and that growth may require suffering, but out of suffering, He produces hope. Trusting God When You're Struggling, Overcoming Obstacles to Faith by C.E. White. Read by Annie Dinn. Copyright 2020 held by Connie E. White. No portion of this recording may be reproduced without prior written consent. This book contains footnotes, including many scripture references, which are not read in this audiobook. You can download a free PDF with the footnotes at www.cewhitebooks.com/Trusting God Footnotes. All C.S. Lewis and Oswald Chambers extracts were read by permission. Copyright information for those works is included in the footnote guide. Scripture quotations, unless otherwise indicated in the footnotes, are from the ESV Bible, copyright 2001 by Crossway, a publishing ministry of Good News Publishers, used by permission.